Okay, it is now 2 o'clock, and so I resume the hearing. Yes, it looks like there are a number of cameras switched off, I think meaning that those people haven't yet joined, but I will, in any event, continue given that it's 2 o'clock. So as I promised then before our break for lunch, I will hear from the council on the issues that we have just been talking about, and then move on to issue 23.1C. So is that does that pleasure come to you, Mr. Smith?
It does, sir. Thank you. Yeah, I think obviously we heard a wide range of contributions this morning. But I think in broad terms, we've sort of tried to distill them down into some key areas around the SLAR, the Greenbelt review method, and our approach. So rather than sort of responding to individuals' points individually, so okay, we'll just sort of wrap it up in that way. Starting with the SLAR, obviously, paragraph 159 of the MPPF tells us we should prepare it to establish realistic assumptions about availability, suitability, and likely viability of land. And then there's associated guidance in the planning practice guidance. And the council obviously considers the approach to the SLAR is robust and follows those steps, and with particular reference to site identification. I'll refer you back, and you don't need to look at this now, but ED 145, which was our kind of homework from the Matter 9 session, which looked at site selection the first time around. That contains a detailed timeline of the SLARs and the rolling approach to site identification that went on from sort of 2008 through 2016, and in total has assessed well over 400 sites from a wide variety of sources, and that includes those put forward by developers in response to call for sites, but also sites identified by the council and put forward in response to plan consultations. And further to that point, the SLAR does contain a number of previously developed sites and previously developed land. And from the methodology on the back of our paper B, you can see that is a specific area where we did proactively go in search of additional opportunities between the Reg 18 and Reg 19 consultations. So in the very top left, there's council identified PDL sites in towns. We went through an exercise, and again, I think the correspondence for that is in ED 145, where we went out looking for those. Obviously, the SLAR, the practice guidance is clear about the SLAR is informing the preparation of the plan, and obviously the preparation ends at submission. But with regards annual updates since that point, we have continually updated the trajectory of developable and deliverable sites as required by paragraph 47 of the NPPF. As Mr. Parkinson, among others, has acknowledged, those updates have occurred frequently throughout the course of the examination. And we've set out, including at the sessions last week, some of the sort of broad reasons as to why perhaps there aren't the sort of significant volumes of previously developed land that people might want to see. The trajectory updates that we refer to have picked up on those sites that have come forward since 2016 that we, for whatever reason, didn't pick up in the housing land availability assessments, and they are all included in the supply side figures, both completions and permissions, in the latest update in ED 191B. And in that latest trajectory, we also have further windfall allowances allowing for further previously developed sites to come forward.
I was going to say, is that through windfall and other commitments?
Yeah, it's through, as you say, existing commitments, and also there's the windfall allowances in there, which which again we sort of evidenced off the back of the first round of hearing sessions as a realistic source of supply in the future.
Mr. Barclay, can I just interrupt? I'm afraid I've only just been able to get onto the system because I had to close down a battery. So I've missed what Mr. Smith has just said.
Oh, okay.
Really sorry about that, but there it is. Technology.
Yes. Without wishing to do Mr. Smith down, Mr. Aspinall, I don't think you've missed an awful lot. Not so far anyway. So yeah, Mr. Smith was just going through issues relating to the SHLA and what the council did in relation to that, and was just telling me about how since the completion of the SHLA, the council has updated the trajectory throughout or during the examination period. That's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Shall I continue?
Please.
Yep. And I think in looking at the SHLA and its conclusions, and particularly in relation to sites beyond the Greenbelt, I think we just need to be conscious of the context of the district, and that we can't necessarily take a one-size-fits-all approach, because I know some of the comments this morning were around sort of how and when sites were discarded. And we've set this out previously, but with the exception of Royston, the rural area beyond the Greenbelt is generally characterised by smaller, more dispersed villages, which by their nature are more sensitive to development and less sustainable locations. Whereas the Greenbelt, by contrast, is largely concentrated around the main towns in and adjoining the district, and also our largest villages, which in general terms are the sorts of locations where development is more likely to be considered suitable and sustainable. And obviously in those Greenbelt areas, you know, as we've said on a number of occasions, those boundaries haven't been reviewed for over 25 years. And so in that context, our paper B at paragraph 10 makes of what we said at what points in the process. And in doing so, we would acknowledge and agree with Mr. Parkinson's points from this morning that exceptional circumstances need to be demonstrated for each individual site, but that is also nested within an overall view on whether exceptional circumstances exist at a strategic level. And again, going back to Mr. Parkinson, he's correct that HOU1, so the Housing and Greenbelt background paper, was at the point of pre-submission in 2016 and submission in 2017, effectively the written explanation of those choices, drawing on the findings of the evidence base and the sustainability appraisal as a whole. And HOU1, that background paper, looks at both the broad principles, so the overall case for the exceptional circumstances, and also site specifics. So as Mr. Parkinson referred you to, Appendix 2 has got that commentary against each site as to why we think they are appropriate for allocation. I think the point he made on growth villages and the explanation of them in HOU1 regards meeting overall housing needs is perhaps a bit of an oversimplification. I mean, yes, they do help meet those needs in full, but I think in putting those sites up for consideration in that site selection process, there's clearly a judgment through the SHLA and through the sustainability appraisal that they are appropriate locations for development within a structured settlement hierarchy in the first place. And in looking at sort of the individual towns and villages, to pick up on the point made by Mr. Watts, that the wider evidence base does consider matters of infrastructure, and without wanting to get it into site specifics, because I appreciate that comes later, paragraph 23 of our paper B does make specific reference to Codicot as an example of selecting sites in a way that ensures necessary infrastructure can be secured and sustained. So in that instance, with reference to primary school expansion. But HAU1 isn't where we finish the story. At your request, sir, following submission of the plan, we updated the housing trajectory for the first time in ED4, and that formed the basis for the original hearings.
Yeah.
And then at matter 7 and in our associated statement, we set out our kind of in principle view on exceptional circumstances, which included a number of factors, including there being no reasonable prospect of development being met in locations outside the district, such as central Bedfordshire, which is one of the suggestions you've heard today. And then our individual matter 10, matter 11 statements and the associated hearing sessions on the sites set out site-specific circumstances for each individual allocation that we were proposing to release from the Greenbelt. So you had the council's clear and up-to-date explanation of both the general and the site-specific exceptional circumstances in light of the then current trajectory when we had those original hearings. And obviously since then we've had the review update, and you've heard our view supported by Mr. Deanwood that that's been conducted in line with best practice, and that the approach was robust. Again, touching on what we're going to come on to, that the update also importantly re-evaluates in chapter 5 of that document the sites where the judgments have changed, and that does include consideration of whether those allocations should still be pursued against both Greenbelt and non-Greenbelt alternatives. And the review concludes as a matter of judgment that those allocations remain appropriate. And that's been obviously subsequently reinforced in our paper B predominantly, which we've looked at this morning, but our paper C on east of Luton and paper D, I think it was, on the safeguarded land west of Stevenage, also set out the specific exceptional circumstances that we say apply to those sites. And moving us up to date, the matter statements for our current sessions provide further information, including, as Ms. Parkinson observed, that a number of the Greenbelt sites are now critical to our rolling 5-year supply, which in itself is a key requirement for the plan to be found sound. And in that regard, I'd urge a degree of caution in sort of the claim that the circumstances around our exceptional circumstances have changed because we've updated the trajectory, but you also then need to take into account what those trajectories are telling us. Namely, as we said last week, the council's land supply situation is increasingly dire, the backlog's mounting, the time left in the plan period is diminishing, we're reliant on a stepped and backloaded approach. And a number of the local housing allocations in the growth villages are required to boost and sustain that supply and 5-year supply in the short term. I know you've asked us for some more information around that and the effects of taking some of those sites out, which we'll get to you shortly. So I think to conclude, exceptional circumstances is a judgment to be made in the round, having regard to all of the evidence. It's not necessarily just a case of directing yourself to those documents that have Greenbelt in the title. It's looking across everything we've submitted to you. It was Mr. Bolton identified exceptional circumstances can arise from an accumulation of circumstances. And exceptional circumstances, obviously, is a high bar, and reliance on sites which have a significant Greenbelt impact is an important factor of very significant weight that goes into that judgment.
My apologies, Mr. Smith, I didn't catch that bit.
So, exceptional circumstances is a high bar. We acknowledge that completely, and reliance on sites which have a significant impact on the Greenbelt is an important factor of very significant weight that goes into that judgment. But that judgment also needs to be made in light of the facts and the area and the site-specific contexts. And we consider, as a matter of judgment, looking across the whole piece, that those exceptional circumstances do continue to exist and the evidence supporting that position is robust. And I just conclude by noting that actually, if you look at a number of the submissions in this round of hearings, including today, that ask you to consider alternate sites in the Greenbelt, both in this district or in central Bedfordshire, those submissions would actually seem to accept the existence of exceptional circumstances to meet either North Hertfordshire's own needs or Luton's unmet housing needs as a matter of principle. The disagreement seems to be around the site-specific circumstances for individual allocations. And that's me finished.
Okay.
Unless you have any questions, obviously.
Yeah, just on this was raised by one or two people in slightly different ways, I think, but people pointing to the site selection process. And I know we did touch on this in previous hearing sessions, I know, but people were asking about whether there were sort of weighted criteria, and in effect, I think Mr. Parkinson, as Mr. Parkinson, I think, put it, where do we see that in written form? Do I understand it correctly? The council's view on that is that, in fact, site selection is something that's come about by taking various pieces of evidence and making those judgments as a matter of professional judgment on the part of officers in the first instance, presumably in the council, rather than a more rigidly laid out methodology with criteria.
Yeah, I think that would be correct. I think you can't sort of surgically split Greenbelt out into an entirely separate consideration or any of the matters. In fact, it's with all these instances, it's a case of, yeah, of kind of site-specific and local area-specific circumstances in coming to a view. As we've said, in some villages, you might need a certain quantum of development to secure and sustain infrastructure improvements, which goes to the point of how many sites you might look at, which you take into account as part of that process.
Sorry, Mr. Smith. Yeah, I can see that people are raising their hands. I've been quite clear that I'm not going to take any further points on this. I'm going to go after I've heard from, finished hearing from Mr. Smith. I'm going to go on to 23.1C. So I'm getting a bit of feedback from somewhere as well. Yeah, it might be you, Mr. Smith, I'm not sure. That's a bit better. It sounds like you're sitting next to a tumble dryer.
No, definitely not.
Okay. Yeah, just on the point that Mr. Parkinson again raised about considerations that you have looked at in site selection, such as, well, he pointed to amenity concerns, harm to listed buildings. He gave those as examples, and he said fairly, I think, that those were valid considerations. But his complaint on that, I think, was that there wasn't a, how should I put it, a direct head-to-head between those sorts of issues and Greenbelt harm. What do you say to that point, Mr. Smith? I think I've characterised that fairly enough, but if you think otherwise, let me know.
I think looking at the sort of examples he was citing, or appeared to be pointing to, those were sites of the same kind of smaller villages, which is the point I was saying about you can't necessarily look at the Shire as a one size fits all. You have in the rural east of the district in particular, you have smaller, more dispersed villages, and you might take a different view of the suitability of a site in that context than you might if a site with similar constraints was located on the edge of a larger village or in a town, because there's a kind of added layer almost around the overall character of those settlements or their sustainability.
Yeah, I think the point there, if I understood Mr. Parkinson correctly, I think the point there was more about the point at which sites were discounted for other good planning reasons, but at that stage, harm to Greenbelt, or the degree of harm to Greenbelt, was not necessarily one of those factors. Have I reflected your point fairly there, Mr. Parkinson?
So you've reflected it fairly, and the way you put it in terms of a sort of head-to-head was exactly what I was trying to say, but not encapsulating like that earlier. That that sort of head-to-head, we've got Greenbelt here, we've got harm to the linear core of a village, for example.
Okay, I don't want you to make any further points because I've closed the gate, but so long as I've carried on what you said, fair, that's the main thing. Yeah, what does the council say to that, Mr. Smith?
I think that was the point I was making about those decisions are in part looking at the context of the village. I mean, looking through the Schlab, the only site I think that makes reference to the linear core of the village that we rejected is in Barkway, which is in one of the smaller villages to the east, where, as I say, you might take a slightly different view on what might pass through the gate of being acceptable than you might on the edge of, say, Baldock or Hitchin, where you might look at sites slightly. You might think those sorts of concerns are more surmountable in that location because you're looking at the context of the district. And I think also harm to the Greenbelt isn't per se something that you kind of leave out at that stage, isn't it? Your consideration of exceptional circumstances and harm is kind of, as we've said, a separate consideration almost once you've sifted through the sites in the Schlab and come out with what you consider to be a long list, which, you know, may arise at a list of sites that means you can meet a very large proportion of your sites, your need outside the Greenbelt, or it might not.
So I wonder if I might just come in here. Perhaps Mr. Smith just can help us with the two approaches that have been taken. Some sites have come out of the Greenbelt at a sort of a first sieve stage, which I think is set out in Table A in Paper C. And perhaps Mr. Smith can just explain why that was so. And then I'll come on to deal with the point that you've just raised with him, if I may, please.
Well, those are the ones that in my comments before I sort of characterised as those that, in our professional view, had no reasonable prospect of allocation. As we've said in the comments against those sites, obviously there are a variety of sites in different locations, but for example, it includes sites beyond the proposed BA1 site north of Baldock, where we've said in the update that BA1 is significant harm, and your professional view would be that going to the fields yet further beyond that, as we've said in the reasons given in the Schlab, is bringing forward yet further development in that location in conjunction with the sites to the south would result in significant encroachment to the countryside and development of land which has limited visual relationship with the existing town, just because of the topography and the landscape in that part of the district. So I say that there was a sift where some sites didn't sort of make it over that tests in the Schlab, and it was that smaller list that went forward to be looked at in terms of, well, do these or do these not meet the bar in terms of exceptional circumstances if we get to a point where we need to demonstrate that.
And so it's my understanding that once one's gone through that exercise, the mere fact that what you're left with is potentially sites in the Greenbelt that make a significant contribution to the Greenbelt is not a reason per se to simply take them out. One has to then go on to apply the test that's in the NPPF as to whether or not there are exceptional circumstances to justify the release of that, whilst obviously recognising that significant contribution attracts, as Mr. Smith has said, very significant weight in that exercise in deciding whether or not there are exceptional circumstances, along with all the other factors one has to take into account. I think if Mr. Parkinson is suggesting to you that for some reason a site which has made it through that first sieve exercise should then just be automatically excluded because it makes a significant contribution, that's not what the NPPF says. The NPPF says you've got to decide whether or not there are exceptional circumstances, and that brings into play a whole host of other factors. But of course, recognising you give very significant weight to the significant contribution that the site makes to the Greenbelt.
And is that, how to put this, is that particularly important here because Sorry, I'm getting some very, I don't know if anyone else can hear it, but I can hear some very odd noises coming from some.
I wonder if it's your own computer, sir, because I can't hear anything. I can't hear anything coming from Mr. Smith. I actually can't hear anything coming from you either.
Well,
it's all clear. It's all very, very quiet.
okay. Okay, I shall carry on. If it's not disturbing anyone else, I shall carry on. Look, I can see that there are still people in Raspel and Miss Coutier. I've heard everything that I'm going to hear from other participants on this particular issue. As I said before, the break for lunch. So I'm hearing from the council, and then I'm going to be going on to issue 23.1C, which is about the sustainability appraisal. So if you could put your hands down, please, I'd be grateful. Yes, I was putting a point to you, I think, Mr. Ormsby, wasn't I?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
putting a question.
So I'm so sorry. Can you just forgive me? There is somebody banging on my door. I'm just going to have to tell them to go away. Could you just excuse me just for 1 minute? I do apologise.
Sure. Yes, that's one thing the miracles of modern technology can't take away from our lives.
Apologies, that was the man to read the meter. Yeah, sorry, I do forgive me. Yeah, continue.
No problem.
We were looking at the very significant contribution to the Greenbelt and whether or not that of itself would justify the removal of the site without having to go on to decide whether or not there are exceptional circumstances to justify its release. I think that's the point that we were on, sir.
Yeah, no, it was. Sorry, I can still hear a rather distracting noise, but in any event, yeah. So so the not undertaking that, as I put it, head to head, is that particularly relevant here because the council had already identified that development in the Greenbelt, one way or another, was an inevitability in terms of the aim of meeting the need for housing.
I think I'll let Mr. Smith answer that because I think that's a planning point.
I wouldn't go as far as say it was an inevitability at the time we did the Shire. Obviously, you're not completely blind to what's going on around you in terms of the likelihood that this is going to happen. But I don't think it'd be fair to say we conducted the Shire accepting that Greenbelt release was totally inevitable. It was, it seemed very likely based on the circumstances, but I don't think it was sort of wholly foregone. There was still an exercise to go through, as we've said, in demonstrating exceptional circumstances once you've done the Shire.
Okay.
Are you clear on that, sir? Because if we can clarify further or you need further clarification, we'll do our best to assist you.
No, that's what I understand.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Sorry, everyone, do bear with me for 1 moment, please. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you. So I'm going to turn then, as promised, to issue 23.1C. And the question here is quite specifically about the sustainability appraisal, and it is this. We can say SA for sustainability appraisal. The SA is not influenced by the degree to which land does or does not contribute to the purposes of including land in the Greenbelt. Should it be, Mr. Smith? And I think this is one occasion where it might just help clarify for the benefit of the examination why the council says it shouldn't be.
Certainly. Yes, obviously we've answered your question fairly directly and said no, we don't think it should. And our statement refers you back to our paper B, which is where I will go to, paragraphs 40 to 43, where we said Greenbelt is a policy designation rather than an environmental designation. So the fact that land is or is not Greenbelt does not, in this context itself, have environmental implications. What the SA does do is cover environmental factors which might coincidentally, for want of a better phrase, be relevant to Greenbelt matters, in that it looks at things like biodiversity and landscape and historic environment. There's a crossover there, but our view is that the sustainability appraisal shouldn't be looking at Greenbelt in its own right. And that's something we've discussed with Mr. Deanwood, and I don't know whether it's worth him just setting out his view on how that's dealt with elsewhere.
I think it would. I mean, some will look at Greenbelt and see the council saying it's not an environmental designation, but will think to themselves, well, actually, I quite enjoy the environment of parts of the Greenbelt in the district. So could you just help out by giving some explanation in terms of what you mean about environmental designation? Yeah,
what we're saying there is that Greenbelt is not a designation like, say, a site of special scientific interest or a wildlife site or a valued landscape, which are areas or features that are recognised for their intrinsic environmental value. Greenbelt may well overlay a number of those features, but Greenbelt in itself isn't designated because of the intrinsic environmental or landscape value that you might see in those other designations. It has its own specific purpose.
So in many ways, it's kind of coincidental that land in the Greenbelt can be countryside, as it's enjoyable to some to spend time in.
Yeah, obviously.
Sorry, yes, I was just going to say that is absolutely right, but it might not be.
No, it could equally well be. I don't know. If we were in other parts of the country, it could be a former coal pit or anything.
That's correct, sir. And so the Greenbelt designation is simply just a policy designation which creates an extremely high bar for release or development. It is something slightly short of a policy that just sterilises land for development and no more. When we were coming back earlier to discuss the potential visual impact of developing in the Greenbelt, and one needs to take that into account if there's a differential over the spatial impact. That is a landscape impact which is taken into account under the sustainability appraisal under the environmental heading. But it is merely coincidental that it does that. So all the landscape impact of developing the land, whether it's in the Greenbelt or not, is taken into account in the sustainability appraisal. But it'd be quite wrong to take into account simply just a policy designation, because that's not an environmental matter, which is why one needs to carry out a separate Greenbelt review in order to understand the effects of development in the Greenbelt. and certainly Mr. Greenwood will be able to help us, but certainly it's my understanding, I have never come across a local plan where a sustainability appraisal has covered the issue of Greenbelt. The two are, certainly my own experience, always kept separate for that reason.
Thank you. Is that back to you, Mr. Smith?
I can see Mr. Deanwood's got his hand up, so perhaps best if I defer to him as part of the council's position.
I'll take Mr. Deanwood now, yeah, please.
Thank you. Just to support what Mr. Smith and Ms. Hornsby said, and to back it up as well, the SEA directive is not abundantly clear on these matters, but certainly doesn't hint at the inclusion of it. And actually now we've got quite a lot of experience in preparing SEA and SEAs under our belt around the country now. Most authorities have done at least one. And to reiterate the point, I personally haven't seen Greenbelt come up as an issue within the SA. It is deliberately farmed out as a separate study for good reason, which Mr. Smith, Ms. Hornsby set out. So I don't think there's any reason to revisit why Greenbelt should be included within the SA.
Well, apart from the fact that I'm asking the question.
Well, that's fine. But practice and it's never been flagged up in government guidance. In the whole of consultation on the SA, nobody's raised it as an issue. So I don't think it is something which is reasonable to pursue at this point. I'm not sure what added value it would give one, put it that way.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Deanwood. Did I interrupt you, Mr. Smith, or had you finished?
I was finished, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Ms. Hamilton.
I'm only going to be making a very short speech this afternoon. You'll be pleased to hear, Inspector. Okay, it's just basically a few little points going back on the sustainability appraisal and some things that have been mentioned in the council's response to your question. Okay, first off, yes, I personally and we personally think that Greenbelt contributions should sort of influence the SA really, because Greenbelt and sustainability is quite closely linked, and it has important connotations, especially in this present climate. I feel, you know, with climate change and pandemics and mental health and well-being. They've sort of said in the SA LT4, I believe it was 2.1 page 8, they mention the environment and their priority to minimize impacts on climate change, and they have an objective which is mentioned in the response to you, Inspector, and it mentions objective 2C, and it just seems like we're all a bit backwards in coming forwards, because a lot of it seems to, like, a policy is made and then an action seems to go against that policy. So my example to that is we're going to minimize impacts on climate change, but our objective 2C says about, I've actually got it here, hang on, objective 2C, it says reduce the use of motor vehicles. The problem with that is when you look at some of these sites, I'll use Luton, I'll use GA2, like GA2 is like a pimple on a wall on the end of a nose on the face. So if you can imagine Stevenage is a face, Great Ashby is a bit of a nose and a pimple, and then GA2 would be an extra bit on the end of that. You know, I don't mean to be rude, but Great Ashby, they've all got like at least 2 cars each. They don't do a lot of walking, they don't do a lot of biking, they don't do a lot of busing, and GA2 would certainly be in that respect the same. So, you know, you're looking at minimizing impacts, but then in some of these sites, because of sustainability, you're looking at increasing the use of vehicles. It also says an a just society, that's a section within the SA, and it says promote walking. Well, that's all very well, but if you're removing very important greenbelt that gives a bit of significant contribution, and I can use a few for this. I can use GA2, I can use not GA1, because GA1, as far as I'm concerned, even though it gives significant contribution, it ticks a lot of boxes. GA2, east of Luton, north of Letchworth. These are all used by a lot of people within the area, the urban residents, we'll call them. You know, and it says here, a just society. These are our targets in our SA. We are going to promote improvements in health and well-being. We are going to connect people with nature for well-being. We are going to promote walking. Well, that's very good, apart from if you're going to pick up their pockets of significantly contribution greenbelt and stick it so many miles away that we've now got to get in a car to access another bit of precious greenbelt to do those same things. And the other thing I was just going to pick up on table 5, in their key messages, we say halting biodiversity loss and supporting ecosystems, protecting priority habitats, being advised not to encompass woodland by Hert's Environmental Record Centre. And again, them actions seem to be backwards in coming forwards, because certain sites have shown a high environmental impact, sort of encompassed with their contribution to the greenbelt. And again, we seem to be having these policies, but then going against what the policies are saying, if that makes any sense. That's it. Thank you very much, Inspector.
Thank you, Ms Hamilton. Mr Bolton.
Yes, just very quickly. Greenbelt is a policy constraint, not an environmental constraint. It certainly can have attractive environments within it. It can have unattractive environments within it, such as quarries, etc. So they are different things, and they need to be dealt with separately. And that's our experience of doing both SAs, floor plans, and Greenbelt reviews. They've always been dealt with separately, so it's not confusing.
Thank you, Ms Sananda.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to sort of, I can understand that they are two different things, but the one bit of the Greenbelt definition that I feel really links to sustainability is actual sprawl. Because if you are just putting sprawl on the edge of a town and not really putting the schools, you know, but you're utilising the schools and other shops and everything within the town, then you are sort of bringing a sustainability factor into the Greenbelt. So it probably depends just how big a development you're doing. And it's just that I suspect in North Herts we're getting this issue because actually we're just putting sprawl on the edge of town, but not some of the key services. And that has a sustainability issue. People will struggle to do various things on bicycles and on foot when they're so far out. So that I just wanted to sort of bring that failure to use the town centre really, and to really look at the town centres. That will be sustainable sites, not sort of some of the sites out to the edge. Yeah, that's my comment. Thanks.
Mr Parkinson.
Thank you, sir. I'm just looking at the council's, how the council dealt with this in their paper B. And there at least they did rely on the fact that the SA assessed environmental factors relevant to Greenbelt contribution. I think they've just clarified that to the extent that these objectives referred to there also address Greenbelt impact, that's a coincidence, and we do agree with that. But I think it's also worth noting that your original question said that the essay didn't appear to draw on the Greenbelt review to any meaningful extent. And the council didn't really deal with that particular point in the paper. And it is worth noting when considering how much weight you can place on the essay in terms of Greenbelt impacts, that it doesn't appear that the Greenbelt review was taken into account at all in assessing these objectives. For example, impact on landscape, biodiversity, historic environment. Now, if I just give you the reference, it's page 493 of the essay, which is the significance criteria for the site assessments carried out. And there's a heading there, information to support the assessment. And for each of the objectives listed, it sets out what information was taken into account in reaching a judgment on them. And the Greenbelt review is not listed as an input into the assessment under any of those objectives.
Is that because, if I've got this right, I think the council says, well, it wouldn't need to be,
yeah,
because that's not the. And do correct me if I go awry along any of this, Mr. Hornsby, but it doesn't need to be because that's not the way you tackle the. You first need to look at whether there are exceptional circumstances.
Right, sir. And of course, in looking at exceptional circumstances, one would take into account the outputs of the sustainability appraisal along with any other relevant information. So it's not that you leave it out of account, but you just take it all into account at a later stage and as a separate piece of information, along with the Greenbelt review when you're looking at the impact of an allocation. In terms of its impact on the purposes and fundamental aim of openness.
So to answer your question, which is, why does any of what I said matter? I think there's
I'm not sure I said that, Mr. Parker.
Well, in only so many words, yeah. I mean, I think there's two reasons. I think first of all, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that the SA is fulfilling two requirements. So it's not there just to meet the requirements of the SEA directive and SEA regulations, which is, as the council says, primarily, well, only concerned with environmental effects and therefore environmental designations. There's a separate requirement which the SA also fulfills under section 19 of the 2004 Act to carry out an appraisal of the sustainability of the proposals in each development plan document. And that in turn is to fulfill the section 39 duty of ensuring the plan contributes to the achievement of sustainable development, which clearly does have regard to national planning policy. So the fact that the Greenbelt's a policy designation rather than an environmental designation doesn't mean that the effects on the Greenbelt don't need to be considered through the sustainability appraisal.
So would you bear with me a sec?
And then the second relates to the sort of, does it matter as long as it's somewhere? Does it matter that it's not in the SA? And apart from the point I've just made, I do agree it doesn't, you don't need to, there's no requirement to do your exceptional circumstances balancing exercise, taking everything into account through the SA. So the fact it doesn't do that, it isn't a deficiency, so long as it's done somewhere. And I mean, Mr. Smith a minute ago referred to that balanced judgment being carried out across a whole host of documents. I noted down HOU1, ET4, Matters 7, 10 and 11 hearing statements from 2017, the Greenbelt Review Update, Paper B. And it's important not to be distracted by the sort of blizzard of documents being referred to and look at what they actually say, because those either deal with the in-principle question of why some Greenbelt release is necessary, it's only part of the exercise, or focus on one of the factors that go into the assessment, or they're based on considerations from 2017 rather than 20. So when you're dealing with a sort of moving feast in terms of the OAN changing, a whole range of things going into the consideration, that the lack of a structured approach to weighing those all up and considering the implications for each individual site poses a problem in terms of justification. The essay is the most obvious place to do that. Because it's not been done through the essay, you're being forced to go on a paper chase across various documents from different points in time. So the essay issues are reflective of an overall problem in terms of a clear justification for release in 2020 of the Greenbelt sites in the growth villages.
Yes, well, issues of paper trails can come into play in relation to essays, can't they? But in terms of demonstrating exceptional circumstances, does it matter if I have to use your phrase, a blizzard, or does that not make any difference?
In terms of what?
Well, you say that Mr. Smith points to a number of documents as supporting, in effect, I think, providing in combination the council's stance in relation to exceptional circumstances, both at the strategic level and at the site-specific level. Does it matter that I need to look in more than one place to find that demonstration in and of itself?
No, the fact that you have to look in more than one place doesn't in of itself pose a problem. But what it does mean is that when you do go on that paper chase, it's important to bear in mind when the documents were produced, whether the situation has changed, whether the paper relied on considers individual sites or not. And we say that if you do go on that paper chase, if you ask yourself in 2020 for the growth village sites, what are the exceptional circumstances, you can't find something that answers that question. And the only way it ties into the essay is that if it was done through the essay, you'd have an addendum and you'd have a structured approach and you could see it all together. So the fact that you have to go on the paper chase in of itself isn't the problem. The problem is when you do go on that paper chase, asking yourself in 2020, in the circumstances that exist now, what's the justification? You don't get a clear answer.
So the problem then from your perspective, Mr. Parkinson, is what the answer isn't clear. So I go out, I set about the search. The fact that I'm going on a search isn't a problem, but what is the problem, you say, is what I find at the end of that, or don't find at the end of that. Is that right?
It's what you don't find, and not to be distracted by the fact that on your search you may stop off on various locations. Well,
if it's as long a search as you suggest, I may well need the rest.
You may well do.
Yes, my apologies. I think I interrupted you, didn't I, to start off with Mr. Parkinson? Or have you covered the ground that you wanted to? Mr. Parkinson, you appear to have frozen. I don't know if that's the effect of the blizzard or not. I don't know if you can hear me, Miss Parkinson. If you can, you've frozen. So to keep things moving along, whilst you try and sort that out, I'll move on to the next person. But I will give you the opportunity to come back in. Mr. Griffiths.
So thank you. It's a common misconception in this country, isn't it, that Greenbelt is a countryside policy. Sir, it's an urban policy designation. And for those that haven't heard this before, just briefly to go back to the NPPF and look at those 5 purposes of the Greenbelt. When we designated the Greenbelt originally in North Hertfordshire in the county structure plan, it was done under government policy in Circular 42 of 55. And those were the 3 original purposes of the Greenbelt, which were to check the unrestricted sprawl of the large built-up areas, i.e. London, to prevent those neighbouring towns from merging into one another, and to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. Welwyn Garden City was discussed in Welwyn Hatfield. But then later on, I was on the working party at the DOE that looked at reviewing Greenbelt policy, and we added the other 2 purposes, which were to assist in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, and to assist in urban regeneration by encouraging the recycling of derelict and other urban land. And that's now, of course, in paragraph 80 of the NPPF. The last one, regeneration, has been quite successful, I would submit, in Luton, has it not? But going on from that, I think we're looking at one of those purposes, which is to stop the encroachment on the countryside. And I guess that's where the environmental bit lies. But I think in the sustainability appraisal, is that not picking that up? Because the sustainability appraisal under NPPF paragraph 7 is looking at those 3 aspects of sustainability: the economic aspects, the social aspects, the environmental aspects of sustainability, which we're told in paragraph 8 are mutually dependent. But in my view, I've always maintained that the environment should come first. However, what we have in other documents, of course, is an assessment of countryside and environmental material. But so I think what the sustainability appraisal is giving us is quite a lot of that stuff. In looking at the review of those Greenbelt parcels, it has to a large extent been looking at many of those environmental factors. So I think rather, yes, Mr. Parkinson has described it as a blizzard, but there are various other documents which contribute to this process. But I think certainly in terms of the sustainability appraisal, it does make that contribution. And yes, in terms of the countryside and the impact on the countryside, that certainly should be taken on board. I'm sure you will, sir, because I think that is, we've also looked at the paper B and the way in which Mr. Smith has described the process that the district council has gone through from paragraphs 40 to 43. And in 42, we were reminded by Mr. Lovegrove this morning of the sort of things that were taken on board by the SA. The first of which was about greenfield land and high environmental and amenity value. The rest were social and economic. And I think in many ways, what the council has done is not to give sufficient weight to the environmental matters. And that's perhaps nothing to do with the SA. It's about the whole process that they've gone through. I think that certainly in terms of the environmental factors involved, I think they should be given more weight than the other factors that are being taken on board in this exercise. That's all I want to say, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dorman.
Thank you, Mr. Bartley. Following on from what Mr. Griffiths has just said, where I live here, we have the Chiltern Way walking, going right past my front door. And it's noticeable in the last 6-9 months since the COVID outbreak, the number of people who have taken advantage of the green space and footpaths around here to go walking, it's quite unbelievable how many more people now find that to be of value. And when you consider that to the south of me, the Chiltern Way goes round Cockenhoe and down round the back of the airport, that footpath is now going to be going through a housing estate. So, you know, I don't know what that makes of it. It's about the environment, I think. I think there are any number of research papers that can be drawn upon to make essentially the same point about the importance of the Greenbelt to the environment. But I found one that I think is very germane, which is from the London Greenbelt Council in July 2019. And there's a few quotes that I think would be useful. They said, green spaces help to mitigate climate change because carbon is absorbed by vegetation and held long-term in soil emissions. They also help us to adapt to climate change by absorbing rainwater and cooling our towns and cities. The more green space we lose, the more we're at risk from flooding and rising temperatures, two of the predicted effects of climate change. They added, district and borough councils are absolutely right to recognise the seriousness of climate change and to acknowledge the role that local government can play in tackling the climate crisis. But if they do not also pledge to defend the Greenbelt and countryside from development, then they are failing in their duty to protect our communities and environment. Local authorities in London and the home counties, which have declared a climate emergency in their districts and which propose to adopt strategies and action plans to tackle climate change, are being urged to include policies of stronger for green spaces in their plans, as these provide vital climate change mitigation. They add, the London Greenbelt Council, which represents over 100 environmental and community groups across the region, warns that some local councils are being inconsistent by declaring a climate emergency, but failing to prevent development on Greenbelt countryside and open spaces which provide vital mitigation for climate change. Some of these local authorities are even putting forward large swathes of Greenbelt land for house building, despite their professed commitment to environmental protection. That all rather sounds close to home, doesn't it? Is NHDC serious about its climate change policy, or is it just playing at gesture politics? For my vote, the SA should include the Greenbelt. Very much so. Thank you very much.
Mr. Whale.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Well, the premise of your question is, of course, entirely correct, because we know the SA is not influenced by that degree of Greenbelt contribution, and the council makes no bones about that. So we're at least starting with some common ground. And then we ask ourselves, well, what is the justification for the omission? Where do we find it? And the answer comes in paper B at paragraphs 40 to 43. It's quite a short section. That's what I'm going to focus my attention on. Paragraph 40 begins innocuously enough. It says Greenbelt is a policy designation. Well, we can all agree on that, I'm sure. And then it says not an environmental designation. And here I think we have to pause and think about that. It's plainly not a landscape designation, obviously. It plainly doesn't mean that it's necessarily attractive. It obviously doesn't mean it's a triple SI or a European site or something of that kind. But just have in mind that phrase, it's not an environmental designation, because the council then add in the very next sentence, the fact that land is or is not Greenbelt does not in itself have environmental implications. And I'm afraid I just can't accept that bold proposition. As I say, it may not mean the land is attractive, But if you have land next to you that is suddenly released from Greenbelt, or by the same token included in Greenbelt, then in my submission, of course, it has environmental implications in terms of decisions on planning applications, the openness of the land, preventing urban sprawl, and the other purposes of Greenbelt. So in my submission, that sentence in paragraph 40, it really points up the failure to include the Greenbelt contribution in the essay. And then you ask yourself, I suppose, well, does it matter? Have the council dealt with the point in some other way? Because they say, well, and I use Mr. Parkinson's word by coincidence, they cover environmental factors in the essay. But the difficulty here, I make 2 points, and I'm just picking 2 from Mr. Wilson's hearing statement. Firstly, they rely upon the impact of, quote, perceptions of openness. Simply don't know what that phrase means. It's not a phrase I recognise. Certainly not one I can find in the NPPF Greenbelt policy. And then paragraph 41 of the paper B, according to that paragraph, the essay doesn't purport to cover all of the 5 Greenbelt purposes. So my conclusion is that the council is wrong to assert that Greenbelt has no environmental implications, and unfortunately the essay and the way in which it's carried it out doesn't remedy the mistake. As I say, I identify 2 points here orally: perception of openness, whatever that means, and the failure to cover all 5 of the Greenbelt purposes. So, sir, you're right to pose the question. The premise is right. One only has to ask your question aloud to know that the answer really has to be yes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Whale. I'm going to take a short break now before coming back for the final session of the day. So during the break, please, if you can once again turn your cameras off and mute your microphones, I'd be grateful. It's now 3:14. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 3:35. Thank you.
So just to tell you, your microphone's not off.
Thank you. Yes, I'm always the last. Okay, it is now 3:35, and so I resume the hearing. Yeah, there are a number of people who haven't yet switched their camera on. I don't know if that means that they haven't yet rejoined. I have Mr. Coates as the next person in line to speak. Are you there, Mr. Coates?
Yes, I sure am. I'm here.
There you are. Thank you, Mr. Coates.
Okay. The 5 purposes of the Green Belt includes a bullet point referring to protecting the countryside from encroachment, as Mr. Griffiths has already pointed out. I would put it to this inquiry that the term countryside is a bit of a non-concept if it doesn't include the biodiversity thereupon, therein, and for that matter, thereabove. Therefore, this inclusive interpretation of the term countryside is, I put it to you, available without going against any government policy. And my view is it's the only logical one, the only one which makes sense. Therefore, it should be considered within the SA. If it's not considered here, I fear biodiversity is considered nowhere. Sorry to use the B word, but it rather is the elephant in the green belt, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Ms. Hamilton. Ms. Hamilton, are you no longer? Oh, there you are. Ms. Hamilton, you were indicating?
Yes, I just wanted to support what Mr. Dorman had said. He's right. In this present climate, this year has just alone gone to show us how imperative this land, some of this land, is to the communities in regards to well-being, etc., etc. So yeah, I agree with that. We did a petition over a couple of months during the pandemic to highlight how much the use has gone up drastically, which again questions that raising vehicle use and against the climate change. But I would just like to draw on one thing, and that is in response to Ms. Ormsby. And Ms. Ormsby made it clear that obviously the SA is completely a separate entity from the GBRU, and the GBRU deals with the Greenbelt, which to me highlights the actual importance of that, not just as a we really need to do it, it's a tick box exercise, there you go, but it just sort of concretes the fact how, you know, if we're not combining a sort of a green belt influencing the SA in regards to environmental constraints, biodiversity, and all, you know, and a just society, that, you know, it just goes to prove even more that the GBRU should be now being used to review and assess some of these allocations and this actual local plan as a whole, you know. And as Ms. Ormsby say, it's the Greenbelt review update. So yes, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. Mr. Bolton.
Yes, just very quickly on the issue of the separation between the SA and the Greenbelt. As Mr. Griffith has pointed out, the requirement for an area to go into a Greenbelt is not a requirement. One does not assess, if you like, the environmental attributes of the land into whether or not it's included in the Greenbelt. That's not the assessment one takes. It does not, the environmental benefits of the Greenbelt are a byproduct of the fact that the land is kept open, but it's being kept open for the specific purposes, which are the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt. Now, I find it quite difficult with those who say the Greenbelt is an environmental policy, because to some extent, I think that there is at least some evidence that the Greenbelt around the major cities of this country have actually increased the distance travelled by people to work and to get services rather than decrease them. I mean, the option, if like in blunt terms, facing the country is, should the growth of London in terms of its economy and demand for labour, should it be met on the edge of London, where one can, if you like, get into or integrate into the existing transport systems to travel, if you like, into the capital city? Or does what we used to be referred to some time ago, leapfrog the Greenbelt into non-Greenbelt settlements beyond the Greenbelt and then travel in either by car or by train? And you've already heard today and previously the pressures, if you like, on the infrastructure going into and out of London. It seems to me that is a function of the restrictive policy of Greenbelt, if one needed a demonstration of it. Therefore, you know, planning is not simple, and one is pulled in different directions on this. The more sustainable locations, i.e. locations next to existing services and facilities, quite often are also locations which would perform a Greenbelt function. So that's a dilemma one has of producing a plan, and to suggest that it's not there, I think is wrong. And I think also to try and suggest that the prevention of sprawl or the impact on a historic vistas into an historic town is a environmental matter, the same as impact on a triple SI, I think is wrong, and they are rightly separate because they deal with different things. And yes, they do give you a dilemma at the end of it, which is really what we're here to discuss. But trying to, if you like, mix them all up together is not going to assist you, and it's not going to assist the decision maker. So the two things need to be kept separate.
Thank you. Ms. Pearce.
I just wanted to say that in the sustainability appraisal, there's no account taken of greenhouse gas emissions from the proposed construction of the houses. And there's a historic Scotland study that said that the construction of a house will emit around 80 tons of greenhouse gas. So that would amount to around 1 to 2 million tons of greenhouse gas. That there is, in fact, also that I wanted to bring your attention to, Inspector, the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive, and that requires greenhouse gas emissions to be considered. And I believe that comes down to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change.
Thank you. Does that complete your what you wanted to say, Ms. Pearce?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Cotter.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to share with everybody some of the paragraphs I picked out, which I think are pertinent to this question, whether or not the Greenbelt contribution and to the purposes of it should be included in the sustainability appraisal. So I'm looking now at what the the PPG has said about this, because that's why I tend to go there from, as a starting point. Otherwise, I think people, I mean, I understand the degree that flexibility and innovation of the interpretations are important, but I think there's a limit. I think you can deviate from it too far. And I think that this may be the case with the Greenbelt. We've simply deviated away from what's clearly stipulated. And I think that this is relevant, and I can see a connection between several parts of this that then relate back to your question. And I think from that's what I'm going to give as my answer. So a sustainability, I'm looking at the strategic environmental assessment and sustainability appraisal guidance in the PPG. So and I've just gone straight to the first paragraph, and then I'll take it from there. So it says that a sustainability appraisal is a systematic process. It must be carried out during the preparation of local plans and spatial development strategies. And its role is to promote sustainable development by assessing the extent to which the emerging plan, when judged against reasonable alternatives, will help to achieve relevant environmental, economic, and social objectives. So the fact that it's used as a calibration tool to judge reasonable alternatives against other options seems to me to be central and pivotal to what we're talking about regarding are there exceptional circumstances, which in turn relates to has there been adequate examination of the reasonable alternatives. So without this sustainability appraisal and its systematic process, which gives us some criteria against which to measure something, without that relating to Greenbelt, how can we possibly hope to have a measuring rod to hold against these various options and gauge which one's a good alternative, which one is not so good? So if I go then on to look at the little criteria, I mean, obviously always long, these things are always long. So I just picked out the flow chart. There's a little chart of criteria. Sorry, it's a checklist for strategic environmental assessment regulations. And when I got to F, it seemed to me to relate to all the things that people have been saying so far about how it's important for the communities that are living close to the Greenbelt, how they use the space, its effect on human health, the landscape, how it divides, how it acts as a clear dividing line between the townscape and then what lies beyond it, the green world. And so F says that one of the checklist items, F is one of the checklist items, and it says the likely significant effects on the environment, including issues such as biodiversity, population, human health, fauna, flora, soil, water, air, climatic factors, material assets, cultural heritage, archaeological heritage, landscapes, and the interrelationship between the above factors. And of those things listed, the Greenbelt contains so many of them. So whilst somebody said it was these things that occur in the Greenbelt are byproducts, I think that's a really binary way of looking at it, because these things are all interconnected and one arises out of the other, and it's not a case of you can really put an exact hierarchy on it. They're all coexisting synergistically, which is what they then go on to say. These effects should include secondary, cumulative, synergistic, short, medium, and long-term, permanent and temporary, positive and negative effects. So there's lots of aspects to the checklist, which then I relate to the PPF itself and the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt, as particularly the one that Jed pointed out, the urban and Miss and that other lady pointed out, Miss sorry, I don't remember your name, but Son something, to assist in urban regeneration by encouraging the recycling of derelict and other urban land. So why, when we have centres containing much empty property, be that residential empties or commercial empties, would we not use that first? And how would we, how can we avoid putting that into a sustainability appraisal when the sustainability aspect of regeneration of urban derelict property connects so directly to the Greenbelt purposes, that we attempt to protect the Greenbelt by avoiding building on that and instead using up the empty derelict brownfield land that we have within our town areas, which the councils either appeared not to have listed or don't want to list or don't want to acknowledge. That's yes, I would say that if we do not include if we do not acknowledge that certain sites contribute significantly to the purposes of the Greenbelt, then we're chipping away at them, and thus we're moving in the opposite direction to NPPF 134, and then it even goes on to say in the next paragraph 135 that the strategic larger any should be new Greenbelt should only be established in exceptional circumstances when planning for larger scale developments such as new settlements or major circumstances, and any proposals for the new Greenbelt should be set out in strategic policies. And yet again, it talks about in C, the item C beneath that, show what the consequences of the proposal would be for sustainable development. So how can we not include the Greenbelt contribution into the sustainability appraisal, which is the method by which we're going to assess the degree that we meet sustainable development? And even the MPPF has acknowledged that it goes back to paragraph 135. And I think a lot of our questions are answered in the NPF and the PPG. And as tedious to read that as they may be, especially trying to summarize them in your mind and connect all the interconnected parts together, I think they're really useful frameworks to work with, and we should be moving more closely with them and using them perhaps more as a checklist rather than, you know, our machinations. Oh, we think it's this or we think it's that. Let's look at what it actually says really closely, and really be quite meticulous in how it applies. Rather than arguing, perhaps we'll cherry pick, this applies, but no, this doesn't apply. When the policy in the what was it I was looking at yesterday? I'm sure I remember. I've looked at so many things because there's so many things connecting to everything's connecting to everything, but you have to try and summarize it and pick it out. But I think yes, short answer, it should have been included. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Watts.
Yes, thank you, sir. I share Carolyn Cottier's view and Stephen Whaley's view and others. I believe that the assessments of the purposes of designating a Greenbelt should have been included at the outset as part of the sustainability appraisal. There are two reasons for saying that. One is that the sustainability appraisal underpins the full gamut, the whole process of developing a replacement local plan. You start off with assessing issues and options for the district, working through them, coming up with the preferred options, and then going forward to a proposed submission plan. But if you don't start from the right basis, then you've missed a whole raft of assessments which should have been undertaken. It seemed to me that in a district where around 30% of the area is Greenbelt, but over 80% of the site allocations are proposed on the Greenbelt, this is a fundamental issue for the appraisal, and it should have been considered right from the outset. Some speakers have tried to differentiate between Greenbelt designations being merely a policy designation, whereas others, National Park, AONB, conservation areas, are more enshrined in legislation, perhaps, have more of a weight that should be ascribed to them. Well, again, I disagree. Greenbelts were first designated in legislation, or at least the power to implement them, in 1938, 1947, and then required by law in the circular of 1955. Yes, there are policies governing Greenbelt designation and protection, and the important thing about Greenbelts is their permanence and requirement to be maintained as open space for all sorts of purposes. Now, conservation areas, yes, they're enshrined in legislation, but their boundaries can be amended. There are specific policies governing what you can do, what you can't do in conservation areas. The same applies to areas of outstanding natural beauty. So I don't actually differentiate between Greenbelt designation and other forms of designation, but because of the district's, in a sense, uniqueness and the way in which it's promoting a significant number of allocations in the Greenbelt, this surely has environmental impacts and implications which should have been picked up right from the outset in the sustainability appraisal process. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Goatley.
So thank you very much. Just a few points, if I may. The criticisms that have been levelled, including by Mr. Whale and Mr. Parkinson, and indeed from others as well, essentially have rather put a lot of things into a single pot, and perhaps end up with what might be an unfortunate degree of circularity as to the approach to be adopted. The first thing to say is that a Greenbelt is not a creature of statute. Not this Greenbelt, whether or not earlier manifestations of Greenbelt at earlier times were such creatures. Certainly the Greenbelts we're dealing with now, or Greenbelt we're dealing with now, is not a creature of statute. But it is necessary for the purposes of this issue relating to strategic environmental assessment to go back and understand what it is we're dealing with and what is it that both the regulations and, for that matter, policy and guidance are looking for plan makers and those advising plan makers to do. Starting, if I may, with the strategic environmental assessment regulations. So I would particularly invite you during what may be described somewhat laughingly as your leisure time.
It's my leisure time slipping away from me once again.
I think that's possibly slipping into 2023 at this rate, sir, but let's just stick with the concept for the moment and have a look, please, at Schedule 2, and for that matter, Paragraph 6, which sets out a series of issues upon which the likely significant effects of the environment, short, medium, long-term, permanent, temporary, positive, negative, secondary, cumulative, and synergistic, would be likely to arise. Not for dictation purposes, sir, but just to give you the gamut of those. Biodiversity, population, human health, fauna, flora, soil, water, air, climatic factors, material assets, cultural heritage, including architectural and archaeological heritage, landscape, and the interrelationship between all of the matters that I've just referred to. Now you'll note that within that there is no reference to Greenbelt or to policy requirements. The second statutory feature, if I may come to, relates to sections 19 and 39 of the 2004 Act, Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, to which Mr. Parkinson referred. They themselves refer to, among other things, the need to have regard to either sustainable development or, for the purposes of looking at the objective of contributing to that, having regard to national policies and advice regarding sustainable development. That itself doesn't answer the question as to what sustainable development is, nor is it, in my respectful submission, adequate to say, well, there's a policy relating to greenbelts, and because of what's said in section 39, that imports every policy that the Secretary of State comes to. So that, in my respectful submission, doesn't help you to that extent. But if and insofar as you are taken to national policy, and insofar as greenbelts are concerned, under the 2012 version of the NPPF, which so I understand to be that which is in play for the purposes of your assessment, paragraphs 84 and 85 are material, because when drawing up or reviewing greenbelt boundaries, local planning authorities should take account of the need to promote sustainable patterns of development. And 85 bullet point 1, ensure consistency with the local plan strategy for meeting identified requirements for sustainable development. So that, in one sense, takes you around the gamut of those matters, and certainly the regulations don't require you to engage with the issue of greenbelt for the purposes of the sustainability appraisal, giving rise to compliance with the SEA regulations. So we look, if we may, to what the local planning authority, the council, has done. So if you'll note LP4, the appraisal, and I'd ask you to have a look at the key sustainability issues, first of all identified in table 17, and then when those are picked up, and that's page 45, and that's the top number of the NHDC page number, and thence to table 19, being the appraisal framework, which goes through economic activity, land use and development patterns, environmental protection, climate change, and a just society, and then looking at matters such as resource and waste and town centres. There is an extensive, I always shy away from simply saying comprehensive, but an extensive consideration which is set out within the way that the SA has gone about looking at matters. And a number of those matters have a clear reference in terms of landscape, countryside, avoidance of waste, and among other things, the position so far as heritage assets are concerned, have a very clear reference to the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt. It's not because they are the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt, because as has been identified by more than one contributor, the objectives, or sorry, the purposes set out for Greenbelts, insofar as those are dealt with by the sustainability assessment exercise, that is effectively a coincidence. It's a coincidence which meets the matters of concern both directly and more specifically than perhaps the 5 purposes, which, as Mr. Griffiths was indicating a little earlier, essentially now are codified as 5 purposes to provide the policy basis for, in effect, urban protection and the avoidance of coalescence of settlements. There is no suggestion of criticism with that broader purpose here, but it is simply to avoid what might be described as a conflated exercise of trying to indicate that there is error on the part of the authority in the way that they carried out their sustainability appraisal, when in fact there is none. They have dealt with the Greenbelt review issue within a different dimension, but they were not required within the sustainability appraisal to effectively elevate a specific policy objective beyond the manner that they have done so, and where I've provided, so I hope, succinct references. Now, one matter that Mr. Whale particularly picked up the authority for, and that was in context of paragraph 40 of paper B. And that was because it was said that the Greenbelt is not an environmental designation in itself. And he said, well, if you were next door to it, inevitably you would feel the consequences of it. So with respect, the points that are relevant there is the phraseology of in itself, it is not an environmental designation in itself. And I respectfully say that is correct beyond peradventure. And if you look at the various factors identified for the scope of the essay in tables 17 and 19 of the essay, something that Mr. Deanwood indicated had not been subject of previous critical comment, then I would say to you, sir, that those meet the questions of environmental issues that would arise both properly in context in here, and also the issue at least inferentially raised by Mr. Whale, that somehow if development were next door on the Greenbelt, then essentially you would know about it. Short point at the end of all of that, sir, is that there is no error of process. There is always going to be someone seeking to point criticism at an approach the authority have taken. But I would invite you to look back to those matters and looked at in their totality. I would very strongly suggest to you that there is nothing within that that indicates that there is an error or omission that should impugn any decisions made upon the basis of that assessment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Okay, are there any final points on question C before I go to the council for their final reply? Before I close the gate. Okay, consider the gate closed. Ms. Hamilton, was that a deliberate attempt to sneak under the closing portcullis?
Yes, but I was in two minds, sir, because I just wanted to ask you regarding what we were discussing the other day. I've contacted Mr. Smith and North Herts regarding the windfall sites and smaller sites to try and get some sort of link or a direction to where I can find these lists. And they're obviously in hearings, so they haven't been able to get back to me. So I just wanted to ask you if we could ask them to forward them to me, please. That'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Take that as having been done. Ms. Cotier.
Yes, that reminded me when Nikki said that we're unable to access. We have a repeat of what happened back in 2017. We're unable to access North Herts government data sets. If you recall, they were all taken offline over the period of Christmas 2017 to 18, and we had Miss Cheryl Pearce, who was chair of Gravely Parish at the time, had a lot of people contacting her because we were trying to put in our response statements to the Greenbelt matter back then, and when we had to raise it with you, I think it was in the January sessions, and you asked that they be put back. And many data sets, including the Greenfield, the Green site, the Greenbelt list, allotments, all their registries that they have, empty homes was on there as well. And if you go onto government data sets and do a search for North Herts, all their documents are inaccessible when you click on them. It's literally the same repeat of the same thing that happened before. So, and we needed those because we were trying to compile a chart of brownfield alternatives, and we wanted to bring as many indexes together as we could. So could they be requested to put that back up again? Because we need it basically to carry on our research, to engage with you on all these matters.
Yeah, Mr. Smith, do you know what the situation is there?
We've certainly not taken anything down. I think Ms. Cottier may be referring to, did you say government data sets as in available through the government's main website? 'Cause obviously we don't have any control over that. And
no, you do.
There.
We went through this last time. You have, it's like the thing that links to your authority's data sets. So there's a breakdown that occurs between you and them. And as other authorities are working, and the breakdown only applies to North Herts, as it was last time, it was traced back to some technical issue with you and them. And Louise Symes was the person who dealt with the complaint, because once it was put back online, I wanted to know, in case it happened again, how it came to occur, so that should it occur again, we would know the reason why and tackle it quickly. But all I got back was, in my complaint response, was an admission it had happened, but no explanation as to why or who was responsible behind the scenes. But they managed to get it back the next day really quickly. So I'm presuming that it would be as fast to get it back again this time. So obviously, as it happened before, we just need to repeat whatever we did before to bring it all back. If I can, government data sets.
Okay, can I ask Mr. Smith for could you ask someone in your team to have a look at that,
yep,
and see what the issue is, and get that sort of resolved outside of the hearing.
Certainly. Yep.
I'll send to Nigel Smith. I know you're not checking your emails at the moment, but I'll send you an email with the exact link to the pages that aren't working, so you can just go straight there, and then you can see for yourself when you click it on, and then you can send that to whoever's responsible for technical in your council, and hopefully they'll
okay. Yeah.
Online for us. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. On that then, the drawbridge is up on issue 23.1C. Mr. Smith.
Thank you. I mean, I think we'd probably just reiterate the points made at the outset, to be honest, with a couple of additional comments. Firstly, obviously, our position remains that the Greenbelt is an environmental designation that falls to be considered within the SA. I think we've made that fairly clear. We think Greenbelt is an issue to be kept separate and considered on its own. Exceptional circumstances are considered outside of that process. And I think a number of the other points referred to really kind of went to kind of mitigation measures or policy requirements through the plan. So mention of, footpaths and links to the countryside and so on. They are matters that are addressed within the policies. I appreciate that doesn't get over people's kind of in principle objection to those sites being developed, but they are matters that the council is aware of, is sought to incorporate. And I guess it goes to kind of the master planning points we were making last week. And I think just finally, to come back on Mr. Parkinson's blizzard point, having sort of checked back through the Greenbelt review, I do note that none of his client sites in terms of the villages for growth are kind of subject to your subsequent questions, in that they haven't had an uplift in their findings. So in that sense, obviously the case we set out to you when we had the original hearings in 27-18 largely still stands for those sites, and therefore the paper chase, as he put it, really in the meantime is really our updated position on housing supply alone. Seems to be the only thing that's really changed in relation to those sites, rather than there being a kind of disparate paper chase across multiple documents. And obviously you've got access to our latest position on all of that. I think that's all I had to say, unless Ms. Ormsby had any further response to any of the legal points that were raised.
So I don't think I do, no, unless I can be of any further assistance to you, as long as you've understood our position.
I have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Coutier, your hand's raised. Is that just because you didn't put it down? Yeah, now Mr. Watts has got his hand up as well. So I couldn't hear you then, Ms. Coutier, because you were on mute.
No, I was just checking what the situation with the data sets that I just talked about were, and I've actually managed to get inside the local authority land and property register. So at least one of them is working again. So I'm going to go, before Harrison Nigel Smith, I'm going to go through them and properly check. So if he doesn't, no news will be good news. So if I find anything's wrong, I'll pursue it. And if he doesn't hear anything, it means everything's back to being fine again.
Okay, marvellous. Mr. Watts, I'm assuming this isn't on 23.1c?
No, it isn't, sir. It's a more of a broad question about the remit you have as the inspector for the examination. It relates to your ability or your remit to be able, at the end of this process, when you write your report, to make planning judgments about whether or not sites should either remain in the Greenbelt or should have their contribution to the Greenbelt upgraded from, for example, moderate to significant, or indeed vice versa. Do you feel, in terms of your role and your responsibilities, that you have that power, that remit to do that as part of your report?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, one thing I will say, that if I think that there is a problem in relation to site selection generally, then my approach will be to ask the council to look again.
Okay.
Really, if I consider that there are specific problems with a specific site or sites, then that's a little bit different. But that may have further ramifications in terms of, if there was a need, for example, if a site had to be deleted, if there was consequently a need for a new site to be brought in, again, I would not, in the first instance, go about selecting that site. That would be something that I would ask the council to do, to consider what site or sites would need to come forward to replace it, if indeed such a replacement were necessary.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification, sir.
Okay, good. Are there any other housekeeping points or anything like that before I close for the day? Very good. In which case then I make it 4:19. This time, if you can please actually leave the meeting, I'd be grateful. It's now 4:19, and so I adjourn the hearing to resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.